All right, let's kick it off. Hello and welcome to today's live stream from Runoff to Resilience, Rethinking Stormwater with Green Infrastructure. My name is Amanda Major and I'm the Outreach and Events Coordinator at the Connecticut River Conservancy. Today, I've summoned some rain here in Western Mass to set the tone for our live stream. We're excited to learn about the impact of stormwater on our watershed. We'll highlight some green stormwater infrastructure projects in the Connecticut River watershed and hear about CRC's stormwater program work. We certainly got a lot of information to learn about today, and luckily we have some great speakers to share their expertise with us. Before we start, I want to share a few key reminders. Please keep your mic on mute during the presentation so our speakers can be heard without distractions. We love and encourage your questions. Please type them into the chat box below. We'll save time at the end to answer as many as possible. As always, feel free to depart whenever it's best for you. We're recording the episode and we'll post it on our YouTube channel, where you can also view recordings of past live streams. And finally, I'll be sending out an email later today with a link to the recording, some follow-up resources, and other ways you can stay connected to CRC's current work. Now, let's welcome our speakers. Our first speaker is Charles Soucy. Charles joined the CRC team in January 2025 as the Vermont Program Associate and became the Stormwater Project Manager in January 2026. The primary focus of his job is to provide project management and technical expertise to develop and complete stormwater and green infrastructure projects in Vermont and New Hampshire. Charles holds a Master of Science in Environmental Science from Antioch University, and a Bachelor's in Biology and Religion from Williams College. He's also the Vice President of the Connecticut River Valley chapter of Trout Unlimited. Our second speaker is Lys Gant. Lys is a member of Save the Sound's Ecological Restoration Team as their Green Infrastructure Project Manager. Lys will be working with various community members and stakeholders on green infrastructure projects. Before working at Save the Sound, their time was spent working at food justice and sustainability organizations. They enjoy using their experience working with the community members on Save the Sound's green infrastructure projects, with a focus on locations where people are most affected by environmental injustice. Lys is a graduate of Southern Connecticut State University and holds a bachelor's in geography. And they're starting a Master of Science in Coastal Resilience this year. Our third speaker that we hope will join us is James Houle. Jamie is the director for the Stormwater Center at the University of New Hampshire. His responsibilities include directing and managing the Stormwater Center's growing body of research projects. Dr. Jamie Houle holds a PhD in natural resources and environmental science and has over 20 years of experience with water quality related issues in New England, and is a certified professional in stormwater quality and a certified professional in erosion and sediment control. We're so thrilled about this excellent lineup today. So now let's get into it. Take it away, Charles.
Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, and everybody can see me all right? Excellent. Okay, great. Welcome everyone. Good afternoon. See a few of you already in the chat. Welcome, welcome. Thank you for joining us on this talk. As Amanda said, I am Charles Soucy and the Stormwater Project Manager with Connecticut River Conservancy. And I'm just going to provide sort of a brief sort of introduction to some context for the Connecticut River Valley and CRC specific as it pertains to stormwater, and then we'll hand it over to Lys for them to get into some good details. So I wanted to begin with just some stormwater basics, and it's generally, stormwater. It's in the name. Water from storms, generally rain, but all sorts of forms of precipitation that fall onto the land. And in the, upper right-hand corner here, I have a little figure sort of showing the difference between what happens with Rain that falls in a natural environment, how much of it evaporates, runs off, or infiltrates. And the difference from that sort of process versus what we have in an urban environment. And as you can see from the image, there's far, far less infiltration, far more runoff. So, what happens to rain that falls in our neighborhoods? How do we humans manage that precipitation in our developed areas? And as I said earlier, precipitation is runoff from storms on developed areas and other impervious surfaces that can cause, flooding, erosion, and even carry pollutants into surface waters. So precipitation, rain, hail, sleet, snow, and any others. Developed areas, we're talking buildings and homes, roads, parking areas, and even to an extent, lawns that don't really infiltrate as like natural grass meadows or such. Um, and why is it important? Well, obviously flooding and erosion is dangerous. It endangers lives and properties and communities, can have significant effects, um, on both the natural and the human environment. In addition, stormwater pollution is going to continue to grow as our developed lands expand and climate change intensifies. So, the EPA recognizes stormwater as one of the growing forms of water pollution, nationally. So it is a real big concern for them. Um, Traditional stormwater systems are sometimes called gray water systems, and we'll get into those differences as we move forward. But it's infrastructure that's often made of, hardscape materials, your concrete, your metal, and your plastic. And its primary purpose is just to convey stormwater away from developed areas. We want to manage our runoff and we want to prevent flooding from our communities and our downtowns, our businesses, our industry. So the gray infrastructure we're using are like gutters, ditches, culverts, pipes, catch basins, storm drains, and even some retention basins. We'll get into some of those maybe in a little while, some of the differences of traditional retention basins versus how they could be used and improved in a green stormwater infrastructure method. But the idea is managing flow and volume of water. There's no treatment. It just all sort of goes through, conveys, gets off the land in the quickest way possible, straight untreated into surface waters. So why does it fail? Well, often these traditional gray water systems are antiquated. It's, some of our towns have um, still ceramic or even wooden, pipes and such. So these are just systems that are, made with materials that are just not meant to last as long as they've been put into use. Also, as we're familiar with many towns, especially small towns around our area, there's a lot of delayed maintenance due to really tough budgetary decisions for small towns. So often they aren't operating at peak capacity because they're not in top shape. The capacity also for these systems are developed um, for the past, for historical development. So as we've continued to grow and develop our land, our stormwater systems are just not keeping up. And then you have climate change, increasing frequency and intensity of storms, really exacerbates all of these problems of above and creating some real challenging situations where this infrastructure fails and can fail in a fairly spectacular way. Next slide there, Amanda, please. So when gray infrastructure fails, what happens? Well, as we've talked about already, flooding, erosion and pollution. Click one more time for me, Amanda. And what I want to outline is sort of what is the cost of this? When this fails, what happens? So the EPA estimates that urban flooding costs the US over $9 billion annually. And many communities throughout our watershed have definitely been impacted all the way back to Irene and way before, but also much more recently, 2023, 2024, we had some serious flooding issues that caused lots and lots and lots of damage. Erosion, the U.S. Joint Economic Committee estimates that the annual erosion-related costs in the U.S. on an annual basis is between 180 and 495 billion dollars on an annual basis. Erosion that threatens buildings and infrastructure, homes, properties, livelihoods, etc. And then pollution, the EPA again recognizes stormwater as the only source of pollution, water pollution that is growing nationwide, but also estimates that the cost to the investment needed to be able to handle the water pollution that we currently have on our plates and is coming along would bring to the tune of $67.2 billion of investment needed over the next 2 decades. So, our gray infrastructure, our traditional stormwater infrastructure is definitely coming up short. And we need to find, better methods to deal with these issues. Go ahead, next slide, Amanda. So one of the ways that CRC and many practitioners are approaching this problem is to invest more in green stormwater infrastructure. So these are, systems and practices that are meant to mimic how the land would respond to precipitation stormwater when it's a natural environment. If we did not develop it, how would this land operate and handle this water? And so utilizing these natural processes, we capture, we absorb, and we can even filter stormwater near where it falls, rather than conveying it somewhere else, potentially into surface waters, conveying it to our wastewater treatment plants for them to deal with it. We're treating it and managing it where it falls. So nature-based solutions, we're utilizing plants, we're utilizing soils and permeable surfaces. If we can, we want to infiltrate the stormwater as much as we can. Common examples that people will, be able to readily identify are things like rain gardens, permeable pavers, riparian buffers, those filter strips of trees and bushes near your streams and rivers are very, very important. Including, bioswales. We're still trying to convey water, but in the process of transporting it from one section, of town to another, there can be infiltration as you go along. So a couple of example photos. In the lower left, that's an example of a bioretention practice at a school. In the center is actually a cistern or a rain barrel. These can be above ground or below ground, but as a means of controlling flow and especially peak flow, storing that and either allowing it to slowly release at a controlled pace over a long period of time, or, it's a great option for water reuse and water conservation. The benefits for green stormwater infrastructure are large and myriad. We could have the opportunity to improve water quality, mitigate some of the flooding effects that we have, reduce urban heat due to just all of the amount of hardscaped, area that is absorbing heat and then radiating it back out to us. It improves biodiversity and habitat in suburban and urban environments. There's plenty of aesthetic and social benefits from beautification, mental health, economic benefits from having a green, downtown that promotes people walking, being in your town, going to your shops and patronizing them and such. And of course, as I touched upon previously, water conservation is also a big idea. Being able to infiltrate water and potentially recharge our local aquifers and water table is, a big, big benefit as we deal with climate change that presents us with both really large, intense, frequent storms interspersed with drought, where there's just not enough water. It's a real feast or famine sort of situation we often find ourselves in these days. So that's sort of the context and a bit of introduction I just sort of wanted to give to sort of set the table here. So I'm gonna, pause here for a bit, hand it over to Lys. They will go through, a bit more into detail of green stormwater infrastructure, their work in Connecticut, and really I'm excited for Lys's talk because you all get to see what this looks like in practice as opposed to a concept. So let's take it away. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Charles, for the introduction. And I'm gonna share my screen now and let you guys into my world of green infrastructure work. You guys can see that all right? Cool. All right. So, as was mentioned, my name is Lys Gant. I use they, them pronouns, and I am the Green Infrastructure Project Manager for Save the Sound. And if you aren't familiar with Save the Sound as an organization, we do a ton of work in the realm of ecological restoration. We have other facets to Save the Sound, water quality, legal action, policy work, but where I specifically am centering my work is within ecological restoration. I'm a part of the Alexander Center for Ecological Action, and we do a lot of hands-on habitat restoration, which includes things like dam removals. It includes marsh restorations, wetland restorations, and then, as we will be talking about today, nature-based solutions like green infrastructure. And I am one of the two-person green infrastructure team at Save the Sound. And we get the immense pleasure of being able to implement some of these really incredible nature-based solutions to be able to capture stormwater. Um, so, as Charles mentioned, there are a number of factors that can contribute to water quality issues within our watersheds. One of the big ones that we talk about here at Save the Sound is impaired water bodies. There are a number of impaired water bodies, as you can see highlighted here in the gray and gold colors. Those are all water bodies that are impaired within the state of Connecticut. There's around 80 that are fully impaired. Some of the ones I work in, though, the most are ones that are within the urban areas of Connecticut, specifically around New Haven and Bridgeport. And then just to give you a more geographic context of all of the regional work we do, because we also do work within New York, highlighted in red here are the impaired water bodies found within New York State, of which there are around 50 water systems that are impaired. So you might be wondering, what makes a water body impaired? When we're talking about impairment of water bodies, we're talking about some sort of chemical, physical, or biological change that can cause environmental degradation. Um, there are physical components that can do that. For example, dams or culverts, things that can cause sediment to build up, things that can cause increased turbidity or like particulate floating in the water can cause some impairment of a water body. Anything that can alter the temperature, all of those things are physical elements of impairment. When we're talking about implementing nature-based solutions, however, we're talking something more along the lines of chemical or biological impairments. When we're thinking chemical, we're talking things like your chlorides, your salts, your road salt, your sand, greases and oils that come from your car, your fertilizers, your pesticides. And then we're talking biological, we're talking more like bacteria, colonies, macroinvertebrates, algal blooms, stuff of that sort. All of those things can put additional burden on a water system and cause it to become impaired, which means that it's just not safe for our traditional recreational uses. Some of the other things that can contribute to specifically the biological end of impairment when we talk about especially urban water systems are things called combined sewer overflows. For those not familiar, combined sewer overflow, or CSO as it's referred, is a antiquated is a good way of putting it, as Charles put it, sewer processing system, which essentially means that not only do you have a system that is processing what comes from homes and businesses in the way of sewage, so brown water, you also have water coming from homes and businesses that's gray water, so like think your shower water, your sink water, etc., and also is getting contributions from our stormwater systems. So all of that water is going into one pipe, where it, in an ideal world, ends up at our water treatment plant, gets processed, and then it's discharged. However, given the antiquated nature of these systems and the fact that we have ever-growing populations, especially in urban areas, these systems are no longer equipped to handle the capacity of water being put into them. We also, as Charles mentioned, need to start factoring in climate into these equations. And so for so many reasons, we have this increase in material ending up within these sewer systems that it can just no longer handle. It doesn't have the capacity to handle that amount of material coming into the system. So what I like to say is it's almost like a light switch. On a dry day, the system functions like it should. Water gets to the water treatment plant, it gets treated, and it gets discharged back into whatever nearest body of water is has an outfall. However, on a day where it is rainy, once the sewer system hits that finite capacity, it's almost as if someone has come in and flipped a light switch, and everything beyond that capacity point is discharged completely untreated into our waterways. And so that is why oftentimes, if you live adjacent to a CSO system, you will see after rainstorms, they will put like a temporary hold or moratorium on fishing or shellfishing because of high bacteria levels. That is because of bacterial coliform, E. coli, etc., forming in the water because of these CSO discharges. This is something a lot of urban areas have started to move away from. But unfortunately, moving away from those systems costs a ton of money. And so because of that, it's a slow turnover. And New Haven, Bridgeport, I think Groton, and there's one other municipality in Connecticut that I can't recall off the top of my head, all are still existing on these CSO systems. So all this to say, there's a lot of water ending up in our water bodies. Some of it's contaminated, some of it's not. So, what do we do to help? What can we do to help manage that stormwater that's falling a little closer to where it falls to maybe alleviate some of that burden on our sewer systems? We look at nature-based solutions. So what I'm going to be talking through today are primarily rain gardens. I'll touch a little bit on bioswales, but a vast majority of what we are doing right now at Save the Sound is based around rain gardens for capturing stormwater runoff. If you don't know what a nature-based solution is, it's a landscape feature meant to mimic nature, and we use it, as I mentioned, to collect and infiltrate stormwater runoff. Rain gardens can come in a variety of shapes and sizes. Residential rain gardens, which I'll talk about a little later on, usually entail some sort of downspout disconnect, which is essentially taking your stormwater that would otherwise land on your roof and then go down your gutter, down your downspout, out onto your driveway, into the road, and eventually into the nearest body of water. We disconnect that and redirect it into a rain garden, which is a pretty cool system at a residential level. And then when we talk about municipal implementation of these sorts of installments, it's usually pulling stormwater off of things like lots, right-of-ways. We've done some large buildings, and these spaces are usually going to be filled with native plants and shrubs, which help facilitate that infiltration process. So, how does a rain garden work? This is a really simplified version of how a rain garden works, but essentially you have stormwater that's flowing off of your impervious surfaces. impervious surfaces being right-of-ways, parking lots, driveways, your rooftop. Um, Anything that doesn't allow water to penetrate into the ground is an impervious surface. Um, then once the stormwater flows off of that impervious surface, it ends up meeting this almost sponge-like installation, which is plant roots that suck up water. It filters out harmful pollutants. Some of the pollutants get trapped in that soil, and it slowly infiltrates down back into the groundwater layer where it re-enters the watershed at a much cleaner state than it would have had it just flowed off of the impermeable surfaces and into our waterways. So, what this looks like on a residential scale is a really involved process that involves a lot of work on our end, a lot of manual labor, and a handful of steps to get you to a really incredible installation. So a little bit about our process. I will say we just wrapped up a 2-year program to implement, I think it was 40 residential rain gardens throughout New Haven and Hamden. And all of these properties were identified based on the Environmental Justice Block Group data set that's put out by the CDC previously. And this basically allowed us to identify specific neighborhoods that were of higher risk for environmental justice issues, such as flooding, inundation and storm events, etc. And so through this process, we ID'd specific neighborhoods in New Haven and Hamden that were of higher risk. And then those were the neighborhoods that we targeted with our canvassing for these gardens. We were very lucky enough to have funding that allowed us to implement these gardens for free to the homeowner. So we would come in, we would do an assessment of the property, which looks like taking a look at their like usually their lawn, taking a look at their lawn area, seeing, identifying where their downspouts are, looking at any topography for the property, what their available space looked like for a rain garden. It also means taking a look at the roof area, which I could talk about. There's a couple really helpful tools for that. Establishing what the sizing of the rain garden would need to be, purchasing materials, arranging tools, ordering plants, coordinating delivery. Before we even get into the installation process, making sure we contact call before you dig, just to ensure that there's no risk of any sort of issues when we get into the ground. And this is before we've even put shovels in the ground. It's a really, really involved process. If you were going to try and implement this on your own property, there's a ton of steps, and sometimes this process can be really arduous. But we found that like once you get into a rhythm of like this is what the process looks like for a residential installation, it isn't quite so bad. Once we have all those steps out of the way, we have to recruit volunteers. Our operation for the residential rain gardens is largely volunteer led. We have at max 1 to 2 staff on site for these. Usually it's just me on site, and a cohort of volunteers, neighbors, friends. It also, that piece adds an additional bit of complication to things because, of course, like volunteers are always really excited about the project and then they get on site and realize they're going to be digging for 3 hours. And it can definitely, you get a mixed bag of volunteers. Sometimes you have some really incredible groups that like crank through a garden in an hour and a half, which is just crazy awesome. And then you have some where you have a group of like maybe college kids that like aren't super enthused about being in the dirt and they take 5 hours to like just dig the garden. So suffice to say, working with volunteers is definitely tough, but it can be really fulfilling. And if you get a good group, you end up with a really incredible installation that gets knocked out in one day, which is really satisfying, especially for the volunteers to see that they go from this lawn that wasn't really serving a purpose to a beautifully planted, functional space that they had their hands in creating. So, when it comes to sizing of residential rain gardens, we take a look at an aerial image of the property, fairly easy to do from your phone, just on Google Maps or Google Earth. Um, if we're on site doing this assessment while we're looking at the aerial image, we can kind of pinpoint on the aerial where the downspouts are located in real time. So for this particular house, we ID'd the downspouts at being two back corners and one of the front corners of the home. We make the inference based on the shape of the roof, on the aerial image and where the peak of the roof is. We make inferences on which way the water is going to flow, with the assumption that water is going to flow away from the roof peaks towards a downspout. So we can pinpoint then which downspouts are the most friendly for a rain garden implementation. If we find, for example, that back downspout where we see that there's two arrows pointing towards it, we've identified a downspout where the flow is splitting in the middle and there are two directional flows of water coming in. Sometimes, given the shape or size of the roof, we may end up being able to capture a lot more water by targeting one downspout over another. Generally, though, when we're looking at identifying a downspout, we're also looking at the proximity to whatever space we'll be putting the garden in. And I will elaborate further in a second when I pull up my next slide. So if you see the image on the right now, it shows the division of the roof. And the numbers that you see in each polygon shape are reflective of the amount of square footage that each of those sections of roof contain. And the reason why I mentioned specifically we focus on proximity is because, as you can see, that back left, the green quadrant of roof area, while I'm sure would have been really great because it's getting flow from two angles, it's picking up a lot less roof area. And it also has a really, really long run to the one area where we would be able to implement a garden. So for this implementation, we ended up selecting the front section because we were A, able to get more roof area, and B, it was far closer to where we needed the water to go. And that's because water is going to follow the path of least resistance, and the less distance it has to flow to wherever you need it to get, the better. Because you're going to start to like lose momentum as you travel a further distance. When we're talking about sizing, like I mentioned, you can just use Google Maps. There is a measuring tool, but what I will say is CT Nemo, which is put out through Yukon, actually has a really incredible rain garden sizing tool that they created. Essentially, you can enter in the address for the property that you're looking at, and you can, using their tool, estimate the roof area by outlining the quadrant of roof that you're targeting. And it'll not only tell you what the measured area is, it's an approximation, so take it with a grain of salt, but it'll also suggest a rain garden size. I believe that their default depth for a rain garden is 6 inches. We'll talk a little bit about rain garden depth in a minute, but there's a couple like math formulas you can do that will allow you to kind of flex the size of the garden based on the depth, if that makes sense. When it comes to sizing, like I mentioned, there's a formula, a method to the madness, if you will. When we're determining the depth of a rain garden, generally we are erring on the side of 6 to 8 inches, which is typical for a residential garden. And the way we come to a garden size from that is we are taking the square footage of the roof and dividing it by our intended depth. The 6 inches is the minimum depth to be able to get 1 inch of infiltration over a 24-hour period. And so what that means is basically if you have a 6-inch ponding area, it allows 1 inch of rainfall to completely infiltrate within 24 hours. Contrary to what a lot of people would believe, rain gardens shouldn't actually be wet. Um, they are supposed to function as spaces that can handle rain and then be completely dry in a 24-hour period. So if you have an area that's already holding on to a lot of moisture, it's not a great spot for a rain garden. Um, if you need to like modify your rain garden size based on depth, or based on the amount of area you have available, rather, you can make your garden deeper, which will make the surface area of the garden that's needed smaller. Um, when it comes to sizing, when we're talking a 6-inch depth, we are talking a bathtub. We really like to like get that into people's heads that like we're not talking about like a bowl. We want a bathtub. We want something that has a 6-inch flat depth along the bottom for the entire square footage. And that is because water is going to infiltrate better in a completely flat surface than it is if you have spots that are deeper or more shallow, where you might get some ponding that doesn't infiltrate. Our main goal is to make sure that that 1 inch of rainfall is gone within 24 hours. Then when it comes to plant selection, my perspective, we always opt for native plants. Native plants are best suited for rain gardens because they're really adaptable. They're used to our climate. They're used to our weather conditions. However, we do adapt based on homeowner requests. We have had some homeowners who have requested edible plants. We have had some homeowners who have requested things that are non-native. As long as it's not an invasive species, it's at the owner's discretion. It's their garden at the end of the day. They have to look at it every day. I don't. And so we kind of cater to those options or cater to those requests as needed. Some of the other things that we take into consideration, first and foremost, light conditions, because as wonderful as your soil may or may not be, light conditions are really going to determine how well the garden succeeds. So if you have like the worst, most compact soil ever, like we can amend that. We can't change how much light you get in your yard if you have a giant tree. So these are all things that we keep in mind when we're determining what's going into a space. We also take into consideration bloom time, and this is more an aesthetic thing, just to make sure that there is continued like action, continued visual in the space throughout the year. So that it doesn't just look like a whole bunch of brown when we get to the fall. Maybe there's some like red osier dogwood that gives you some like contrast to the brown during that time of year. We also have the option of choosing spaces that look really curated, really neat and condensed, or spaces that look very organic and kind of willowy, tall, short. We can be really flexible based on what the homeowner is asking for. When we are selecting plants, we are also planning based on the plant's full grown size. That said, my colleague Nicole and I are notorious overplanters because there is always going to be occasionally plants that fail. And so if you do plant too many plants per square foot, and you get some die off, it's okay. But definitely take into consideration what the plant's full grown size is before you just start putting a whole bunch of stuff in the ground. Be creative about sourcing your plants. Maybe have a couple backup options in case things aren't available given time of year. And then if you're looking for resources for figuring out what you can put in your garden, as mentioned before, CT Nemo, their tool, their app that they have for rain gardens also has a list of plants. I would also recommend the University of New Hampshire. They have a really incredible native plant fact sheet that has a number of things that are native to our region. that could be really successful in a rain garden space. These are some of our normal culprits that you'll find in our gardens. We really like the milkweeds, the coneflowers, columbine, the lobelias, any and all grasses that are native. Um, the holly family, specifically Ilex glabra, which is the inkberry holly, red osier dogwood. There are so many incredible plants that are options for these types of spaces. We love these because they're incredibly adaptable and are good throughout a number of light and soil conditions. And here are some finished rain gardens. So these were from the first iteration of our installations back in 2019. And these were some of our beautiful gardens after completion with their happy homeowners. And as you can see, they're really like simple installations, nothing too crazy. Most of these just take a couple hours to get in the ground. Here's some more photos of implementation in action. And as you can see, like we have a group of kids out. Like these installations are, as I mentioned, very, very much volunteer ordeals. A ton of fun, but as you can imagine, having 15 kids on site can be kind of a mixed bag. But as you saw in those previous photos, they did an incredible job and they came out of it with a really beautiful garden that they helped implement. That said, there are always instances where things get complicated. These images that you see here are from a rain garden installation that we did the first year of our most recent round, when we did the 40 installations. This was put in the ground in 2023, I believe. And going into this, we knew that the homeowner had 18 inches of mulch placed on the property because the soil was, as she put it, trash. What we didn't realize was that the reason why the soil was so atrocious was because underneath the 18 inches of mulch, somebody had tried their best at making a concrete pad for working on cars, by throwing down some lime and some water and some sand and then just kind of compacting it. So once we got through the mulch, we encountered concrete, as you can see in that image on the left. That is one of our amazing volunteers helping us shovel broken up clumps of concrete out of the rain garden space. Not an easy installation by no means. This day was around 90 degrees. And the installation took about 12 hours, which is not typical. But once we get into the ground, it really was a case of we needed to see it through to the end, because we obviously didn't want to leave the person with an unfinished garden. So nothing is ever straightforward. You have some days that are easier than others, but in the end, we end up with some really cool gardens. You also have instances where you get rained on while installing a downspout disconnect or you have broken tools. But in the end, we end up with some really beautiful garden spaces that can really change people's yards for the better and get people excited about implementation of green infrastructure on their property. When it comes to maintenance, this is one of the things that we have found people are afraid of when they hear green infrastructure. They assume it's going to be more work to maintain than a lawn, and initially it might be a little bit of work. We like to say there's two kinds of maintenance that need to happen on a rain garden at the residential level. There's short-term and long-term. When it comes to short-term maintenance, we're talking about maybe weekly watering for the first few months, especially if we're going into like a drought or a drier period. Looking out for any erosion along the banks of the rain garden to make sure that you're not going to get plants washing out or end up with a bunch of sediment in the bottom of your rain garden. Removing any weeds, but especially invasive species, which theoretically shouldn't really need to be done within that first few months, because when we are implementing these rain gardens, we're installing 2 inches of mulch. So we really shouldn't get too much in the way of weeds coming up in that initial period. When it comes to long-term maintenance, we're talking about removing dead branches from shrubs and trees, removing dead vegetation seasonally, pruning of shrubs, weeding as needed, refreshing mulch as needed, but most importantly, cleaning out the downspout entrance to make sure that there's no leaves accumulating. Because as soon as you start getting an accumulation of like sediment or leaves within your downspout, you're going to start getting water that's going to be diverting to the path of least resistance, and that's usually out the side of the downspout instead of to the garden where it should be going. So these are all things to keep in mind when it comes to maintenance. It's not as daunting as it might seem. In fact, it's a lot less maintenance than having to mow your lawn like once a week or once every 2 weeks. Moving on to a municipal scale, we handle things like this a little bit differently, because oftentimes municipal installations are A, more complicated for a number of reasons, and B, much larger. The first implementation I'm going to talk about is the Mill River Green Infrastructure Corridor in New Haven. This was previously, prior to its retrofit, 12,000 square feet of a degraded roadway. The roadway was initially just a dead-end road that was seemingly abandoned, wasn't really maintained, and was used heavily for dumping, specifically construction and contractor dumping. As you can see in the left-hand photo, there's a big pile of bricks and rocks. That was probably the least inundated with illegal dumping that this site was. Oftentimes you can find like furniture on the site. It was a little rough. And as you can see, the aerial view on the right-hand side shows the stretch of road in its entirety. As you can see, there are two roadways neighboring where we would get pretty significant stormwater runoff, which I'll talk about in a few slides. So basically, when we are looking at this space, we're talking about 2.21 acres of impermeable surfaces, which we saw the potential of stormwater infiltration within this space. So all of the areas identified outside of the green space towards the middle of the screen are all the areas that this space is capturing stormwater off of, from multiple methods. So we have some that sheet flows off of the impermeable surfaces, but we also have piping that runs underneath the road adjacent to the site that carries stormwater off of that 1.46 acres downstream to the green infrastructure site. There were a couple iterations of this plan prior to implementation. We worked really closely with biohabitats to develop this plan. We finally ended up coming to a conclusion of a plan that looks that looks like what we have here on the screen. So we have one bioretention area on the south end of the walkway. As you can see, that's going to be capturing surface runoff from the street above. And then we also have three bioretention cells with an overflow connection, which connects to the subsurface piping, which is taking off that 1.5 acres of impermeable surface. So this corridor was a feat, truly. We had to completely construct the area from scratch because, as you saw in those initial photos, it was completely paved over. And we ended up with a really incredible bioretention corridor. That said, there are still some challenges with the space. There are neighboring lots where we have property conflicts. What I will say is the lot that you see highlighted in red initially in 2016 was at the same grade as the bioretention corridor where it stands now. And then in 2022, the lot owner decided to backfill the lot next door. So it is now graded at about 3 feet higher than the bioretention corridor. So as you can imagine, that is leading to some unexpected runoff from that edge. Um, in more recent developments, the owner decided to install some fencing, and through that ended up completely excavating that northern hillside by the three bioretention areas. And so at present, we cannot touch that side of the site because there are erosion issues that we are working on ramifying. We also have some additional issues. I don't know if you noticed in that first photo, but there's a giant pile of white stuff. The Mill River of South Central Connecticut is definitely very industrial. There's a lot of developed industrial and commercial lots that are right along the river, including um, the municipal hub for the state of Connecticut for salt distribution. So we have massive salt piles that are on both the east and west side of the Mill River. And as you can see, the one on the east side of the Mill River butts up right against our bioretention corridor. It has caused some issues with salt seepage coming through the Jersey barriers at the back end of the site, which has killed off some plants. It's also constantly in flux. Those piles are supposed to be covered most of the time. Oftentimes they are not, which can cause some additional issues when it comes to air quality. So there's a number of property conflicts that we have butted up against at this site in particular. We also have dealt with a bunch of invasive species, specifically Japanese knotweed. There are two sizable stands, as you can see circled in red here, that we have repeatedly tried to beat back, but they prove very challenging as Japanese knotweed is. We also have issues with lack of maintenance. This is a site where the intention initially was we would implement the site and there would be other organizations who had agreed to steward the site long term. And it just ended up not coming to fruition. It was unfortunately a situation where we finished the creation of the site and then we're like firmly in the grasp of COVID. So a lot of things fell by the wayside, understandably. A lot of organizations, structures shifted around. So this is a site that we have continued to steward, and it really is a capacity pull. Um, but this is a site that we're not really willing to give up on because of the neighborhood it exists within. But definitely issues of capacity, issues with developing maintenance plans and getting people on board to do maintenance long term are a big, big need when it comes to green infrastructure. We also still to this day deal with some dumping. The dumping has reduced to some extent, and we find that it reduces more when we have people active on the site, which I'll touch on in a little bit. We still are seeing a lot of landscape dumping. We also have some issues with encampments that pop up every once in a while, which was an issue prior to the implementation of the bioretention corridor. It's just more apparent now because we're engaging in the space more. Um, that said, given all the difficulties of this space, it's a really beautiful space that we hope will eventually allow us to cultivate some really incredible learning opportunities with the middle school that's right next door, John Martinez School, and will hopefully in future work become a really, really incredible opportunity for folks who live in the Fairhaven neighborhood to steward a space that they view as their own. Um, this is just some photos from the initial planting. These are all students from John Martinez School who are helping with getting plants in the ground. And our hope is that eventually the space will become a sort of learning laboratory where kids can learn about why green infrastructure is important on a hyperlocal level. We're also, I'm so excited to talk about this. We're also working with an amazing group called Emerge. They're a nonprofit that's based in New Haven, Connecticut. They just branched into Bridgeport. And it is essentially a program that works with folks who are formerly incarcerated, helps them get job readiness training, helps them get some workforce training under their belt. And we're right now working with this group on a green infrastructure maintenance training so that A, they have marketable skills that they're able to take with them once they leave the Emerge program, and B, so that they can help us steward some of the sites like this bioretention corridor, where we need someone who has the capacity to take on that stewardship piece. They're an amazing group of guys. I just did training 3 with them the other day, and they're just incredibly excited about gaining all of this new knowledge and being able to like learn a new trade, which is really cool. Moving on to our biggest implementation, and I believe the second largest implementation of its kind funded by this particular funding source in the country. I think there's like one other implementation that was funded by this source that is in like Idaho. That's bigger, but we have the second largest, and I'm pretty happy about it. This space is in a place called Town Center Park, which is like the main green hub for Hamden, Connecticut. This system was created or was completed in 2023. It was a labor of love, as I'm sure you will get an impression of as we talk through the process. The rain garden is really incredible in its capacity to take on stormwater. It is currently taking stormwater off of 73 almost 74 acres of mixed residential and commercial area that are upstream from this space, and it captures the first inch of runoff. Seeing this system in function is just incredible to watch. I have a number of videos on my phone of like watching the first flush of rainwater coming through. Super cool to watch. But before this rain garden was implemented, it was an outfall that just led from the culvert that you can see in the before photo to the left. You could see it like in the background, a culvert. It led to this sediment-filled pool, and essentially, once it hit that sediment-filled pool, it would just flow out into the park, completely unhindered by anything. And so this very flat, very grassy park on heavy rain events would essentially turn into a lake. So much so that at certain points during bad storms, there were actually white caps in the middle of the park, because of the sheer quantity of water that was coming off of that 74 acres. The problem with this is because of the fact that it was coming off the 74 acres and then was butting up on this really sediment-filled pool, which gave it no opportunity to infiltrate, and then flowing out onto this really compacted grassy park. It was given no opportunity to infiltrate, and then it was being routed through these culverts that you see in the bottom right of the screen, to the Party Brook diversion channel, which is a very urbanized channel that leads directly to the Mill River. So as you can imagine, given the lack of infiltration, there were a lot of contaminants that were picked up along the way that would end up dumping directly into the Mill River. So, as identified in part of the Mill River watershed plan, we pinpointed this location as being a prime spot for a large implementation of green infrastructure. So, what
Can I
that looks
just
like,
jump in?
as you can see
Sorry.
from this
So sorry.
beautiful,
I just want to jump in and acknowledge that it's 1 p.m.
yeah,
and we did say that we'd go until 1.
all
And
right,
if folks can stay, that would be awesome if we can wrap this case study up in about 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll shift gears to the CRC context.
yeah.
But I did want to acknowledge that time limit. So if folks do need to leave, we will send out the recording in an email after this so you won't miss what's to come. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks. So as you can see from this bioretention system, there are a number of plunge pools where the water all comes in, gets the opportunity to infiltrate. And then there is a step system and then a number of bioretention cells, All in all, in the couple years this has been implemented, it has only overflowed 4 times, which is an incredible feat of engineering, given that during every rainstorm it was causing a deluge of water to enter the Mill River. This system obviously had a lengthy process for implementation, as you can see from these photos. It was a complete overhaul of the space. And this is what it looked like shortly after we finished the step system, and it was the following summer after all of our plantings. And as you can tell, it looks like a completely different habitat. And we started noticing the changes in ecology pretty immediately with birds and all sorts of amphibians coming in that weren't in the space before. This is what the main pools looked like before, during, and after. And this is what the site looked like just before completion. As you can see, there's still some plants that need to be gotten in the ground, but for the most part, this is a fully planted space. This also was an absolute labor of love. We did rely really heavily on the town of Hamden for their help with this process. They did all of the construction in-house, which was incredible. But when it came to planting, there were around 6,000 plants that went into this space. 1,500 of those were put in the ground by volunteers. And this is what the space looks like today. It's beautiful. Wildlife use it for habitat, and it handles a ton of water that comes off of impermeable surfaces. What we did find is that this space was a challenge to implement for a few reasons. The season in which it was installed was one of the wettest summers on record. While that was difficult for us, it also did give us a kind of trial by fire of the system to make sure it functioned the way it should. And then there was also issues around equipment because we were depending so heavily on the town. When their excavator decided to take early retirement, it meant for additional complication for implementing the garden space. We also dealt with knotweed on site. There was a dormant stand that got knocked around and kicked up during the construction phase, which activated the rhizomes. So we had to do some remediation to ensure that that knotweed was stamped down before we started truly implementing the site to make sure that it didn't have the opportunity to take over. And while there were frustrating aspects to this, the town engineer always encourages us to celebrate our successes. And we had a really amazing, fairly large space that is able to infiltrate around 74 acres worth of stormwater that comes off of residential areas. So what's next for us? Right now, we're doing a ton of implementation of projects in Hamden, New Haven. We're bridging out to Brantford and Bridgeport. We're also working on green stormwater infrastructure planning with New York City Parks in Queens. And that's the quick rundown of what's next for us. But then I can either open it to questions or pass it back to you, Amanda, for a wrap up.
Lovely. I'm going to pass it to Charles, who's going to tie it in. Thank you so much for going through all that list.
Absolutely.
Such a beautiful overview of all those projects. And then we'll do Q&A at the end.
Beautiful.
Awesome. Mm.
There we go. Okay. So trying to be brief about this, Lys just provided us a wealth of information on, green stormwater infrastructure projects, both in a residential and municipal setting. So what does this sort of mean for CRC as we sort of take our first couple of initial steps here into the stormwater world? And it's generally can be broken down into 3 sort of main thrusts: outreach and education, project development, design and implementation. So outreach and education, we can be the people that are going out, interacting with our towns, private landowners, stakeholders, educating them about the issues of stormwater, the opportunities with green stormwater infrastructure. A great example, the Vermont provides a guide to stormwater management for homeowners and small businesses, which I find to just be a really nice resource there. A lot of these stormwater manuals can be quite technical. You need to be more of an engineer to handle these. This is a great one where it really spells out, very similar to how Lys just went through their process of, going through and doing this as a small homeowner, a small business, and keeping it nice and manageable. Project development is a lot of what I'm currently sort of doing for CRCs, meeting with the individual towns, getting their or private landowners, sort of getting a sense of what projects exist, what are their priorities, where can we find common ground to, take some of their projects that they'd like some help on and help move them forward. So we get it closer to a point of being actually something that has full engineering plans, drawings, designs that we can then, implement. Of course, with homeowners, not as much permitting and engineering needs to go into that, but on a municipal scale, certainly a higher threshold. And then, as I said, design and implementation, assisting, connecting the resources that we have, in a project management sort of manner. Connecting these projects with consultants and engineers that will actually be able to, push forward those designs through 30, 60, 90 to 100% fully designed, be able to work through interaction with stakeholders and towns and everything to create something that, there's a vast majority are in favor of, and then actually, implement it by putting it into the ground. Go ahead to the next slide there, Amanda. So the next couple slides, I just want to quickly touch on some of how we're beginning to take those first initial steps forward and where we're sort of trying to focus our energy. Amanda, can you go to the next slide, please? Oh, wait. I'm looking at two different things. So take one step back for me. Apologies, Amanda. Thank you. We're there. Okay, so Vermont has the advantage of stormwater master plans for the Department of Environmental Conservation, hires consulting firms to work with towns, identify and prioritize a range of stormwater projects from, very small to quite large. There's dozens and dozens of projects that are often identified within these towns, and then, provide sort of like a top, priority projects. It tends to be about 18. That are ready to move forward towards implementation. And then they further develop 3 of those ideas to the 30% conceptual engineering plans to really emphasize that these are meant for short-term implementation. So as you can see here, this is, we've got the watershed in Vermont and New Hampshire here. We've got the river in blue down the middle. All of these towns on the west are in Vermont, and the ones highlighted are those that currently have stormwater master plans in place. So you can see we have good coverage of towns in Windham and southern Windham County. Sort of in the middle, sort of western section there's a cluster that is northwestern Windsor and western Orange County. That's the I-89 corridor cutting diagonally across to the northwest. And then a cluster of some up in Caledonia County. So there's a bit of a spread and obviously some gaps there. But it is, over a dozen towns already that have these stormwater master plans in place. So I focus in on these to, as initial direction for where to go. Next slide. We also partner. So we had the opportunity, we partnered on a project that is close to wrapping up now with the Upper Valley Lake Sunapee Regional Planning Commission. They got a Long Island Sound's Futures Fund grant to do a large scale sort of regional project development effort with stormwater. So it's 57 towns across Windsor, Orange, Sullivan, and Grafton counties across both Vermont and New Hampshire. So we're both sides of the river. And they went through, identified and prioritized a bunch of projects, and then elevated, out of the 100 or so that was their target, elevated about 10 of them up to that 30% level where we can, push that further down the road towards design. So this is a really great resource with a lot of projects identified that we can sort of, pick up and begin to move forward. And then we get to our next slide. So as we're going through these maps, you'll notice we're sort of adding in, and getting a better sense of like what the full area that we're sort of working with in, Vermont and New Hampshire. So we, CRC, wrote a Long Island Sound Futures Fund grant ourselves to do a very similar work to what Upper Valley is doing. So we abut them on their southern end of their project area and extend the work down to the Massachusetts border there, shared with Vermont and New Hampshire. So this is an additional 37 towns in Windham, Cheshire, and Sullivan counties. We aim to prioritize about 60 of those projects across the region and elevate about 60 of them into that, 30% conceptual engineering plans. Taken together, this is about 103 towns on both sides of the river that have identified and prioritized stormwater projects that we can sort of begin to pick up and move forward. So I sort of want to highlight that this is not the entirety of the Connecticut River watershed. We're missing Massachusetts, we're missing Connecticut as well, but also there's a sizable portion of the entire watershed is up in this upper valley. So, over half at this point. So I wanted to sort of highlight how much progress we've made in sort of covering that area. Go ahead to the next slide, Amanda. So just briefly, a little bit more detail. The project development work I started is in Southeast Vermont, looking at 3 towns, Brattleboro, Rockingham, and Westminster. For each of those towns, we're looking at 4 of the priority projects identified in the Stormwater Master Plan for those towns and elevating one of them to that near 30% conceptual engineering design. This work is funded by Watersheds Vermont and will actually be wrapping up here the end of June, of this year. Go ahead for the next slide. Keeping in mind that, we have the partnership with the Upper Valley, this is our specific Long Island Sound Futures Fund work. Again, focusing on those 37 towns from the, Massachusetts border in the south up north towards the abutment with the Upper Valley's project area. But in total, this is, again, funded by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation through their Long Island Sound Futures Fund grant. We're partnering with natural resource conservation districts and regional planning commissions. And this is like a 2-year project that'll go through 2028. Go ahead for the next slide, Amanda. So basic details, we identify the project sites and prioritize them, working with partners, RPCs, NRCDs, our conservation commissions, our lake associations, watershed associations. 6 of those projects wind up getting, 6 of the 60 wind up getting that technical permitting and design assistance to get closer to short-term implementation. We also are going to do a community of practice similar to Upper Valley's project, where we're organizing education and networking events to bring together various practitioners, highway departments, road crews, municipal staff, and other stakeholders to sort of learn what green stormwater infrastructure are, see what's involved, operations, maintenance, and really sort of foster a working community of collaboration and sharing of resources, knowledge, etc. And then a regional stormwater action plan that'll sort of give a really good roadmap documenting all the work that we've done, but a roadmap for the future with a timeline and the resources to put the rest of these projects that were identified, put them into motion towards implementation. Go ahead for the next slide, Amanda. So how can you help? Well, as we get this rolling out, talk to your town about your stormwater concerns. One of the big things that we were hoping to have Jamie, Dr. Jamie, who will join us today, but he reached out. He was unable to make it today, unfortunately, and regrets to miss us. But one of the things he was hoping to talk about was a bit more of town ordinances and policies, etc. and how you can both make it support your town supportive of green stormwater infrastructure, but also make it a requirement for new development to include these considerations. Also, donating to CRC for the stormwater program is a great way. Be curious, ask questions, and keep on learning. There will be more events that we will hold like this to sort of promote more learning about green stormwater infrastructure. You can also visit a practice. There are actually even like bike trails in, like, for example, Rutland, where you can bike around and see all these different practices. So there's some fun stuff to do there. Many opportunities to adopt a storm drain where you kind of check on it before and after storms and clean it up and make sure it's operating as it should to assist town staff. And generally just demand more for your water. Speak up for your watershed and spread the love as much as possible. So I believe that's it. So I think next slide should be our thank yous, Amanda. Yeah, great.